Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Kitty Genovese from New York. Details of this crime became very famous, not because of the crime itself or because of the subsequent investigation, but due to the press coverage that alleged that 38 people had witnessed the crime and yet did nothing to help. This ultimately led to what would become known as the Bystander Effect or Genovese Syndrome. Catherine Susan Genovese, who went by the name of Kitty, was the first child of Rachel and Vincent Andronell Genovese. She was born on the 7th of July 1935 in Brooklyn, New York. The middle-class Italian-American family lived in a brownstone in St. John's Place in Park Slope, West Brooklyn. Kitty attended the nearby Prospect Heights High School, an all-girls school where she was said to be a confident and happy student. She graduated in 1953, and not long after, her mother, Rachel, witnessed a murder on the streets of New York, which prompted the family to move to New Canaan in Connecticut the following year. Kitty decided to remain in Brooklyn and began living with her grandparents. She got a job as a secretary at an insurance company and had a short-lived marriage which was more or less immediately annulled in 1954. In addition to her day job, Kitty began working in a bar in Queens of an evening to earn extra money. In 1961, when she was 26 years old, Kitty was arrested for taking bets on horse races from her customers at the bar. She was sacked from her job and fined $50. However, she soon found more bar work, this time at Ev's 11th Hour Bar on Jamaica Avenue in Queens. The owner was often absent, and before long Kitty was managing the bar by herself. She worked long hours in order to save money in the hopes of opening her own Italian restaurant one day. By 1963, she had become romantically involved with a lady by the name of Mary Ann Zilonko, who she had met at a Greenwich Village nightclub. The two women began living together in a second-floor apartment on Austin Street in Kew Gardens, Queens. This was considered to be a safe, peaceful place to live. In the early hours of March the 13th, 1964, Kitty finished work at the bar and drove back to her apartment in her small red Fiat. At around 3:15 a.m, she arrived home and parked her car in the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station parking lot. This parking lot was approximately 30 metres away from the entrance to her apartment building, which was accessed by an alleyway at the rear of the building. As she got out of the car, she saw someone dressed in dark clothing approaching her. Fearful, she began running towards the door of her apartment building, but before she could get there, the assailant grabbed her and stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty began screaming and shouting, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me." These cries were heard by a neighbour, Robert Moser, who shouted at the attacker from his apartment window to leave the girl alone, at which point the attacker then ran away. Another witness, 14-year-old Michael Hoffman, also saw what he thought was possibly a domestic dispute and told his father, Samuel. Samuel called the police, telling them that a woman had been beat up but got up and was staggering around. This attack occurred 4 years before New York City implemented the 911 emergency call system, and as such the call was made to the local police station. The police did not respond. Seriously hurt, Kitty slowly headed towards the door of her apartment block. She managed to get inside before collapsing in the hallway. Shortly afterwards, her assailant returned. Kitty was lying on the floor, barely conscious, but began screaming the second she saw him. The attacker then stabbed Kitty several more times, including in the throat to silence her screams. He then sexually assaulted her, stealing her possessions and making his escape. Kitty fought hard to defend herself during the brutal attack that lasted over half an hour. Responding to the noise of Kitty's screams, a neighbour by the name of Sophia Farrar rushed to help her, despite having no idea whether the attacker was still in the building. Sophia screamed for someone to call for help, at which point another neighbour and one of Kitty and Mary Ann's friends, Carl Ross, called the police. Sophia stayed with Kitty until an ambulance arrived at approximately 4:15 a.m. Kitty died on the way to the hospital. She was just 28 years old. At 7 a.m. that morning, Detective Mitchell Sang arrived to question Kitty's girlfriend, Mary Ann. Also present was her neighbour, Carl Ross, who had called the police a few hours earlier. During the interview, Carl kept interfering and he was arrested for disorderly conduct. Mary Ann was later interviewed by two homicide detectives, John Carroll and Jerry Burns. The interview, which lasted for over 6 hours, inappropriately concentrated on Mary Ann's relationship with Kitty. Unbelievably, many of the police interviews surrounding the case seemed to focus more on the women being in a same-sex relationship than the nature of the crime itself. Despite the nature of the sexual assault on Kitty, Mary Ann was still considered to be a suspect. Kitty was laid to rest 3 days after the murder in Lakeview Cemetery in New Canaan, Connecticut. In a seemingly unrelated incident, 6 days after Kitty's murder, a man by the name of Raoul Cleary notified the police that he had seen a man removing a television set from a neighbour's house. Raoul, together with another neighbour, Jack Brown, disabled the man's car so that he could not leave before the police arrived. When the police turned up, they found that the man, Winston Moseley, had a stolen television set in the boot of his car. The responding police officer also noted that Winston's car fit the description of that seen by witnesses on the night of Kitty's murder. The police officer passed this information on to the relevant homicide detectives and Winston was questioned. Winston was 29 years old and lived in Ozone Park, Queens, with his wife and 2 children. He worked at Remington Rand as a tab operator. That's someone who's responsible for repairing the punch cards used at the time for data input into digital computers. He also had no prior criminal record. During this police interview, Winston admitted to murdering Kitty. He provided the detectives with the full details of the attack that fit with the evidence that had been found at the scene. Winston said that on the morning of March the 13th, 1964, he got up at around 2 a.m, leaving his wife in bed asleep. He drove his white Chevrolet Corvair around the Queens area looking for a woman who was alone. He wanted to find someone to kill. When he saw Kitty waiting at a traffic light on Hoover Avenue, he decided to follow her. He watched Kitty park in the station car park before parking his own car in a nearby bus stop. Armed with the hunting knife, he then approached Kitty, stabbing her twice in the back, before being disturbed by Robert Moser's shouts. He rushed back to his car and drove away. About 10 minutes later, he returned. After looking in the parking lot and train station, he began checking the entrances to the apartment blocks in order to find Kitty. On the second attempt, he was successful. Winston then attacked Kitty for a second time before making his escape. When asked why he did it, he simply replied, "To kill a woman," stating that women were easier and didn't fight back. Winston then went on to confess to committing between 30 and 40 burglaries in that area before shocking the detectives by admitting that he had sexually assaulted and murdered 2 other women. A few weeks earlier, Annie Mae Johnson had been shot and burned to death in her apartment in South Ozone Park, and Winston said that the previous year, in July 1963, he had killed 15-year-old Barbara Kralik in her parents' home in Springfield Gardens. However, despite these admissions, Winston was only charged with Kitty's murder. Another man, Alvin Mitchell, had also confessed to Barbara's murder, which could have made the prosecution more difficult in this case. But it is unclear as to why Winston was never charged with the murder of Annie Mae Johnson. The trial began on the 8th of June 1964. Initially, Winston pleaded not guilty, but this plea was later changed to not guilty by reason of insanity. Winston gave details of how he had murdered Kitty, as well as information about how he had killed both Annie Mae and Barbara. He also confessed to numerous other burglaries and sexual assaults. The trial lasted just 3 days, and after jury deliberations of around 7 hours, Winston was found guilty on the 11th of June 1964. 4 days later, Winston was sentenced to death. As the sentence was read out, he showed no emotion, but there was applause and cheers from several spectators. Judge J. Irwin Shapiro, who had presided over the trial, is quoted as saying, "I don't believe in capital punishment, but when I see a monster like this, I wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch myself." Shortly afterwards, Winston appeared as a defence witness in the trial of Alvin Mitchell, who had been accused of killing Barbara Kralik. Whilst this trial resulted in a hung jury, Alvin was later convicted of Barbara's murder in a second trial. In the years that followed, the New York Court of Appeals determined that Winston should have been able to argue that he was medically insane at the sentencing hearing, and as a result his sentence was commuted to life in prison. Unfortunately, his life of crime was not yet over. After serving 4 years in prison, Winston had to have minor surgery for a self-inflicted injury. He needed hospital treatment as he impaled himself on a tin can. On March the 18th, 1968, as he was being transported back to prison from the Mayer Memorial Hospital in Buffalo, New York, Winston assaulted the transporting correctional officer, stole his weapon, and managed to escape. He found a vacant house in Grand Island, New York, where he went undetected for 3 days. However, on March the 21st, 1968, the owners of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Kulaga, arrived at their property and were immediately captured by Winston. He held the couple hostage for over an hour, during which time he tied up and gagged Mr. Kulaga and sexually assaulted Mrs. Kulaga. He then made his escape in the couple's car. The following day he broke into a second house in Grand Island, where he held a woman and her daughter hostage for 2 hours before releasing them unharmed. Shortly afterwards he surrendered to the police and was eventually given 2 additional 15-year sentences to run concurrently with his life sentence. In September 1971, Winston was involved in the Attica prison riot. It was a 5-day prison riot where more than 1,200 inmates took over the prison, and it resulted in over 40 people losing their lives. Then, in 1975, a television news report stated that Winston was inmate liaison to Attica Correctional Facility and was working to improve conditions for the prisoners. Also during the 70s, he obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology from Niagara University. Winston first became eligible for parole in 1984. During this parole hearing, he told the parole board that the notoriety he faced due to his crimes made him a victim, stating, "For a victim outside, it's a one-time or 1 hour or 1 minute affair, but for the person who's caught, it's forever." He went on to claim that he had never intended to kill Kitty and that he considered her murder to be a mugging because people do kill people when they mug them sometimes. The board denied his request for parole and continued to do so for many years after. In November 2015, he was denied parole for the 18th time. 4 months later, on March 28, 2016, he died at the age of 81. He had served 52 years in prison, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in the New York State prison system. The case of Kitty Genovese has remained famous and continues to be told in pop culture and referenced academically almost 6 decades later. 2 weeks after the murder, on the 27th of March 1964, the New York Times ran an article on its front page with the headline, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police. Apathy at stabbing of Queenswoman shocks inspector." The article began by stating, "For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens." The headline was mistyped to say 37 rather than 38. A second article followed with information from experts that detailed the psychology of why people did not get involved when they witnessed a crime. Later, clinical experiments followed that discovered that the more witnesses there are to a crime, the less likely it is that an individual witness will intervene. This became known as the Bystander Effect, or Genovese Syndrome, which has featured in psychology textbooks for many years and has often been quoted as one of the problems in modern society. People, particularly in large cities, lose their care and compassion towards others. It has since been revealed that the New York Times report contained many errors, misinformation, and exaggerations. In 2007, an article in the American Psychologist found no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed the murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. It should be noted that due to the location of the attacks on Kitty, of which there were 2, not 3, as reported in the Times article, that only a handful of people were in a position to have seen or heard the first attack. One of these shouted at the assailant, and another called the police. As the second attack took place in the hallway of the apartment block, there was only one person who could have witnessed it: Kitty and Mary Ann's neighbour, Carl Ross. Whilst the report detailed the lack of action from 38 people, there were just 2 detailed examples of this. The first, Carl Ross had heard Kitty being attacked in the hallway of the apartment block. He was a man with a very nervous disposition and paced in his apartment, unsure of what to do. He eventually opened his door slightly and peered out, and witnessed Winston stabbing Kitty. However, he did not immediately report this to the police or go to her aid. Instead, he phoned a friend to ask for advice. The friend said that he shouldn't get involved, and when later interviewed by the police, Carl's defence for his inaction was simply, "I didn't want to get involved." Shockingly, there was also a witness to the first attack when Kitty was stabbed twice. Joseph Fink, who was an assistant superintendent at the building across the street, directly witnessed this attack. He later told prosecutors that he thought about going downstairs to get my baseball bat, but then saw Winston run away. Instead of then going to check on Kitty's well-being, it is believed that her wounds were non-fatal at that point. Shockingly, he decided to go downstairs and take a nap. Despite the news report concentrating on what they would admit in 2016 as being a grossly exaggerated number of witnesses and what the witnesses had perceived, the article did not make any mention of Sophia Farrar. This woman, who was only around 5 feet tall and had no weapon or defence, ran to Kitty's aid without knowing if the attacker was still in the building or how her own safety could be compromised. Sophia stayed with Kitty, holding her during her final moments, in order to give her just a small amount of comfort at the brutal end to her life. Thanks very much for listening to that story. Please add any comments down below. Thanks for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Kitty's murder was one of the factors that resulted in the emergence of the 911 system in New York City and later nationwide. There were 636 murders in New York City that year. Goodbye.